Prior to becoming a creationist, I was what you would call a theistic evolutionist. As a scientist, I had been trained in a secular environment, and yet I knew that I believed in God. Theistic evolution is sort of creation science's middle ground that says that both God and science can coexist. In essence, the theory states that God is the creator of all of the conditions that are required for evolution to take place. God is the author, evolution is the natural consequence of His created world. I came to Christ a little bit later in life, so I was pretty well indoctrinated into the idea of theistic evolution. But when I became a Christian, I began to read Scripture, and I began to be interested in this question of, did God really create us? So when I began to read Scripture, I realized that there were some discrepancies between evolutionary theory and what's written in the Bible regarding creation. And then about 10 years ago, CVC sponsored a conference that was given by several scientists from the Answers in Genesis group. And I had signed up for the conference rather reluctantly. While I was on my way to the conference, I said, God, I know you have something that you want to teach me today. So just open up my mind and my heart to listen to what you have to say, and teach me. He did that day. The very first presentation washed over me like a tidal wave from Noah's flood, and I knew that I was not going to think about God's created world in the same way that I had previously. I began to read everything I possibly could. I also read Scripture more, and especially those parts of Scripture that deal with the issue of creation. My views began to change. As I studied, I became more and more convinced of the evidence for creation. I also realized that it is very difficult to fit Scripture into any kind of evolutionary framework. As a biologist, I have always been fascinated by the structure of DNA. It's simple and yet elegant. The two people that discovered or described the structure of DNA were James Watson and Francis Crick. I sort of considered these two scientists to be my scientific heroes. At some point in his career, Francis Crick began to realize, however, that the conditions that would be required for the spontaneous generation of life from inorganic compounds to organic compounds, those conditions probably never really existed on the Earth. And so he had a problem with how did evolution even begin? Well, instead of coming to the conclusion that there really is a creator God, Francis Crick decided that he would solve the problem by proposing a hypothesis that the Earth was populated by beings from outer space. So aside from the obvious scientific issues with that theory, it's sort of shattered my hero image of these men, and it left me with the question, how can people who are so intelligent and who are such great thinkers be so misled? Now I have come full circle regarding the issue of creation. To me, after evaluating a lot of the evidence, coming at it from a rather skeptical point of view at first, I think the most reasonable assessment is to simply give God His due and proclaim Him as our Creator. Scripture, however, is not a scientific textbook, and it really shouldn't be used as such. But where science and Scripture overlap, they should be and are compatible with one another. I still have questions, and I don't understand everything that I read about this, but I consider myself to be a lifelong learner, and I often pray that God will give me more wisdom and understanding, especially in this area that is so near and dear to my heart.